Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome to a very special webinar mini-series from the home office brought to you by the Centro Institute. My name is Ryan Manchi. I lead the Centro Institute, and I am your host for today. If you're here, hopefully you are familiar with Centro, but if you're not, let me take a brief moment to tell you that Centro is a provider of software and services for digital advertisers. Our technology is designed to boost media, team, and business performance by enabling advertisers to plan, buy, and analyze campaigns all on a centralized and collaborative system that we call Basis. We have an amazing team of more than 700 media specialists, data pros, programmatic prodigies, operations wizards, account leaders, and digital experts who provide our clients with raving fan service at every stage of any campaign. A recording of this webinar and the slides will be shared with you, and we'll have time for questions at the end, and I'm so happy that you joined us today. So we are in the midst of our 5-part webinar mini-series examining industries in flux, where so many industries are dealing with many challenges, but we're also seeing many that are in the midst of massive opportunity. So over the course of the next 30 minutes, you'll hear some insights and recommendations based upon the latest industry trends, consumer behavior, and we'll share some success stories that we're seeing in the market as well. Today, we're talking pharma and healthcare. And to talk about pharma and healthcare, I'm joined by two excellent experts. For the continuation of the series, I'll be joined by April Weeks, who is EVP of Media Strategy and Operations. April brings 2 decades of digital media expertise, and she's partnered with clients across nearly every single vertical, including pharma and healthcare. Today, April leads the teams of those media specialists, data pros, operations wizards that I mentioned before. And we're also joined by Lindsay Freed. Lindsay has over 7 years of experience within the programmatic space and is Centro's National Director of Programmatic Solutions. She works closely with our internal buying team, that's those programmatic prodigies, as well as our sales organization, and working with our self-serve Basis clients, educating them on programmatic best practices and maybe occasionally these days, her favorite Peloton instructors. With that, let's get you, our revered webinar attendee, filled with a healthy dose of the state of pharma and healthcare. April, over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ryan, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Certainly, I believe we could probably very easily spend an hour talking about pharma and healthcare separately. So today, within our 30 minutes, we're going to stay pretty high level and talk about how these two industries specifically are being impacted by the current events with the coronavirus. So today we're going to jump in and talk a little bit about that impact. Then we're going to shift and spend a little bit of time around consumer attitudes towards advertising. And then I'm going to hand it off to Lindsay to talk specifically about some of the advertising opportunities and share with you some best practices and recommendations, specifically in the area of programmatic and how we believe programmatic can be a very helpful media outlet for both of these industries. And then we want to leave time for open Q&A at the end of our session. So with that, let's just get started and dive right in. So first, I'd like to start with talking about the pharma industry specifically. And certainly we all know, as Ryan alluded to, almost every industry is being impacted in some way or another by the current situation. And a lot of research indicates that as many as, upwards of almost 50% of U.S. companies could potentially be hurt or have a negative impact. But the good news here is that although certainly there is some influx and disruption within the pharmaceutical industry, it's categorized as low exposure. This is interesting research that just talks about all the various different industries and verticals out there. And when you take a deeper look at pharmaceutical, while certainly we know that there are changes, people are adapting to the current situation, the overall impact is categorized as low, which is some good news for this category specifically. But talking specifically about what are some of the areas being impacted, if we go to the next slide, it really is in 3 key places. The first of which is resources. And some interesting research just around how this looks for pharma brands and companies. And 95% of pharmaceutical professionals have expressed concern about the impact of the current circumstances in their company's performance. And really, a lot of this fear is anchored in the area of supply chain and possible failures. I think many of us are probably aware, but Asia plays a very significant role in the supply chain, and is really, specifically China, a leader in the development and production of pharmaceutical ingredients. And just knowing that this is a global pandemic, it is certainly top of mind for pharmaceutical companies, and just making sure that there are not disruptions to the supply chain. But more specifically within their companies, it's really around not only human resources, but also production resources. And I think what we still don't quite know yet, and it remains to be seen, the total impact is, what is the shift of many resources being put on the front line to help develop vaccines, medications, specifically in response to the coronavirus? What is that doing to the larger efforts underway inside pharmaceutical companies around new drugs, medication production, or clinical trials? And so those are some things that I think, again, we don't really know. It's probably still a little too early, but are certainly very top of mind for people within this industry. The second is travel restrictions. And I would say the pharmaceutical industry in some ways is very similar to the advertising industry. It is a relationship type of business. Many meetings are conducted face-to-face. We all know that pharmaceutical sales representatives are out, in front of healthcare systems, hospitals, doctors, clinics, really talking about, their products, new trials, new prescriptions to be introduced. And so they've really had to pivot very quickly and adjust how they do business, because they're not able to have those face-to-face meetings. And so that's really requiring them to, this third area, lean in and utilize technology. And the use of technology we're seeing as being very prolific across a lot of industries, and the pharmaceutical industry is no different than many others. And so really leaning in to understand, both for healthcare and pharma, how can companies adapt, utilize technology, whether that be through video meetings, telemedicine, things of that nature. So these are really the three areas of immediate impact that the pharmaceutical companies are addressing and dealing with. And if we go to the next slide, let's transition and talk a little bit about healthcare and the health industry specifically. While they also are in a bit of influx, they're being impacted in different ways, although there are certainly some similarities. And the impact here is really more within the patient and caregiver, as well as within the hospital and healthcare system specifically. Not surprising, there are a few key departments within healthcare systems that are facing a lot of pressure, whether that be the ERs, the ICU, respiratory, as well as infectious disease. And because of that, we're seeing that, upwards of, almost 45% of consumers plan to delay either the medical or dental procedures. Certainly if they're elective and not something that they have to have immediately, they're postponing that. And that's really changing then how they're connecting with physicians and how they're trying to remain educated about various healthcare conditions and needs. Additionally, when you look at specifically patients and caregivers, there's certainly a worry, with over 50% citing concerns about disruption to their medication and, their regimen that they have. And that really ties back and kind of relates to what we're seeing in some of the pharma concerns and impact just around the supply chain. So there's, that's definitely, that concern is straddling both of these industries. And then finally, you can see here, over 65% of healthcare patients and caregivers, cite a lot of concern about what's happening with COVID-19. And that's really around, potentially individuals that have pre-existing conditions or maybe underlying conditions. And I think this is where, when we talk about specifically advertising and marketing, the message becomes so critically important. And knowing that there is this concern, how can brands, both within pharma and healthcare, make sure that they're providing the right kind of education, that they're supporting patients and caregivers through patient assistance programs, and just making sure that the information that they are sharing is highly valuable in addressing these needs and concerns. When we talk about maybe how the shift, and Ryan, if you want to go to the next slide, one of the big areas of opportunity is telemedicine. And as you can see, in a pretty short period of time, there's been a 20% increase amongst adults surveyed saying that they either have tried or intend to try telemedicine. Some additional research that I was looking at cited that 86% of doctors have reported a decrease in their patient load, but yet a 25% increase in online consulting or consultative appointments happening through a digital means. And this is primarily through video calls, telemedicine platforms, things of that nature. So if we think about this, I think it's going to have, potentially after kind of life goes a little bit back to normal post COVID-19, we have to think about how is this impacting consumer behavior and their attitudes and really the adoption of digital platforms on a much larger scale, and will this potentially become a new normal where a lot of our healthcare needs are met through the form of telemedicine. And then finally, Ryan, if you want to go to the next slide, I just personally had a lot of curiosity around how is this impacting the way that consumers might be focusing on their own personal health and wellness. And I was a little bit surprised just at some of these statistics when you look at a 344% increase in interest for home fitness equipment and a 55% boost in online orders specifically for fitness equipment. And all of this really relates to, as we know, gyms closing and people just finding new and different ways to kind of own their own personal health and wellness outside of what might have previously been a normal routine. There was also a really interesting article published not too long ago in the New York Times talking about running and how that is kind of, there's been this new passion and interest in running because it's an activity that can be done, as an individual. You can put the appropriate social distancing in place, but it allows people to stay healthy and active. And so I think we're just starting to see a lot of changes. And as we think about this, for brands that are, in these spaces, it's really thinking about how do you respond, because many brands are doing so in a very strong way and creating community and connection through virtual means. For example, Equinox, with all of their gyms being closed, is doing a lot of messaging through their app and daily check-ins and things of that nature. And then more specifically within the healthcare, really interesting articles and some research out there about Aetna and what they're doing. And they've actually been doing this, my understanding is, for a while, where they lean in pretty heavily to social, a lot of digital platforms where they are providing patient education, information around the benefits of a healthier lifestyle to really support, their customer base. And so I think as we start to see these continued shifts and lean into digital, it's a really interesting way for us and brands within the pharma and healthcare industry to talk about their messaging and their advertising strategy. And then before I hand it off to Lindsay, I did want to spend some time talking about consumer attitudes specifically around advertising. I think, if you're a pharmaceutical or healthcare marketer today, you have, very top of mind is what is your advertising strategy? And a lot of questions around, should we continue advertising? Do we need to shift our message? Is our strategy that we have in place today the appropriate one? Will it resonate? And the good news through this research is, almost 75% of consumers believe it's okay for these brands to continue advertising during the pandemic. And over 50% believe that health and pharma ads should appear next to COVID-19 content, that there is, some natural resonance there. But what becomes incredibly important is the context and the messaging that's put in place. And so because of this, we're not seeing a significant drop in spending for either of these two industries, but brands are definitely shifting how they message. And it's really moving to a place of education and awareness. So, if you're a healthcare system, it may not be about driving, potential patients into one of your centers of excellence or a specific line of service for, in-person consultation, but rather showcasing patient education, patient assistance programs, ways for people to, remain healthy, how they can be aware of minimizing the risk around COVID-19. They want that information. They desire it. They're expecting it. But I think this is where brands in these two industries really have to think about shifting and pivoting that strategy to be more around the education and the awareness piece. And so as I turn it over to Lindsay, this is where we believe programmatic can play a really important role, obviously, with the targeting, and I think being really smart and efficient with the targeting. So she's going to talk to you about what we're seeing and share some tips and best practices. So Lindsay, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, April. Hi, everyone. So I thought I would start with just an overall snapshot of healthcare and pharma spend over the past few years. As you can see, billions of dollars are spent every year in this vertical. But part of why digital ad spend in healthcare and pharma has lagged in growth is due to those FDA regulations that restrict how prescription drugs can be advertised and data privacy compliance laws that do make ad targeting a little bit more challenging. Though the percent of increase, as you can see year over year, is declining, the industry continues to invest a substantial amount of dollars in digital ad spending. Now, of course, in this pandemic, spend has seen some decreases, but as April mentioned, as a vertical, it is on the lower risk side, while the industry is shifting the way it approaches consumers and healthcare professionals during this time. Next slide, please. So it's important to understand that there are advertising regulations for both pharmaceutical and healthcare, both with the overarching need to, of course, be HIPAA compliant. Now, these HIPAA marketing standards require that PHI, or protected health information, which is demographic data that can be used to identify a patient, be private and secure. And that means no one-to-one direct marketing, which presents a little bit of a challenge. So data used to target an individual is modeled or de-identified for that very purpose. In the programmatic space, ads will serve across many publishers through different exchanges. But of course, exchanges each have their own policy as to whether these types of verticals are allowed to advertise, including sensitive categories like pharma. This is actually one of the many benefits of running through a DSP, though. You can have access to a wide range of exchanges, so you will have options for delivery across those that do accept this vertical while keeping these regulations very top of mind. So knowing that industry spend is in flux and that there are certain limitations with targeting, it's even more important now to be efficient with media spend and understand where your audience is. As expected, TV watching has seen a huge increase, which also includes things like connected TV through smart TVs, Apple TVs, gaming consoles, and devices like Roku. There's also been a large increase of online traffic to trusted publishers. People want information and they want it to be reliable and immediate. With increased traffic, though, means increased inventory for advertisers. In fact, I just read a recent article from eMarketer citing how Aetna has really put a focus on their content marketing in an effort to promote wellness. They're using their digital media presence to, what they say, inform, inspire, engage, and help people understand the success stories of others during this time. While typically healthcare and pharma advertisers have actually under-indexed on mobile, these stay-in-place regulations mean more time on tablets and mobile devices for communication with family and friends, and social media for staying in touch. So obviously, making it relevant is still very important for pharma and health advertisers. As I mentioned, not all DSPs or ad buying platforms out there allow for pharma advertising. But fortunately, with Centro and Basis, the targeting capabilities are already integrated into our system. Whether it's based on ad type through native pharma ads or in email ad placement, there's the ability to create these custom site lists of medical journals or health sites that we might see in the open exchange, or even negotiate a private marketplace deal for those. We can have custom contextual segments that help align the creative messaging to the content a consumer is reading about. But along those same lines, brand safety measures can be put in place to help avoid negative COVID-19 content like deaths or terms like pandemic. But it can still serve on content if someone is researching symptoms or facts about coronavirus. In general, these sensitive categories can be targeted or avoided if someone is sensitive to these specific terms. Previously, though, I mentioned targeting via that model data. While we can't target someone one-to-one based on their conditions, through this data targeting, it's possible to reach people who are like others with similar diagnosis or conditions like high cholesterol, migraines, or maybe those that have been just prescribed certain types of prescriptions like Lipitor or Prilosec. So for healthcare, messages often need to reach an audience of medical professionals, so that they might be interested in a specific drug or maybe specific medical technology. These types of audiences can be segmented down to actually the healthcare provider type, nurses, physicians by specialty, or even location-based for those who work at hospitals. Now, I know there's a lot to remember and consider here, but partnering with Centro and our internal pharma and healthcare subject matter experts can help execute and guide strategy for the campaigns that might need to run across this vertical that will help protect your brand image, build community trust, and help reach and inform the intended audience during this time of uncertainty and unknown. And that's it. Thanks.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, April, so much. Lots of good information to digest there. I love the balance of the industry insights and trends, as well as some more practical and tactical areas that we can take advantage of. So now we move into our Q&A time. So there is a questions tab that you should see within the GoToWebinar console, where you can plug in any questions that you've got for Lindsay or April, or maybe even myself. But we'll leave it to the two of them to provide some insight. We've got a few here already. A couple of these is one from Chris and one from Michael that came in. I think even as April was kind of talking through some of the different pivots towards some of the content marketing, which I kind of love, of how, like, I guess other examples of how healthcare companies are communicating with their patients to maintain engagement around programming, and then also just kind of sensitivity with the messaging. Any kind of general, I guess, additional thoughts there, or kind of general comments on that side of the kind of creative, and then also the messaging and type of content?
Sure. I mean, I think, as I kind of alluded to in some of the examples and trends that I talked about, I think it's okay to continue to advertise. It's really, though, being mindful of the context in the message. And the recommendation is to make sure that it's, informative, it's educational, and it provides value to the end user. In terms of sensitivity, I think it's, being mindful of the disruption that's happening, in people's everyday lives, and taking that into consideration and how that translates to, the healthcare and pharmaceutical categories specifically. And then in terms of, places to advertise, I think that remains to be where it makes the most sense to reach the audience. As Lindsay alluded to, historically, certainly a lot of pharmaceutical and healthcare brands do rely on traditional linear TV, but we are seeing, a continued increase in connected TV and digital, and consumers leaning into that. And, to the degree that it makes sense for a specific brand and their messaging, there's certainly some opportunity to leverage social in a smart way. You have to be mindful of the guidelines, both from a creative standpoint, and have the appropriate disclaimers. And then, very much of what Lindsay talked about in terms of targeting parameters, and making sure that you're following those guidelines with no one-to-one targeting, being mindful of HIPAA and things of that nature. Social can also be another channel to explore, and especially depending on your brand and the program that you're trying to support around patient education and things of that nature. So I would say, don't forget about those things as well, because they can also be important.
That's great. Thank you for that. Lindsay, a couple questions about targeting. So today, the year 2020, in late April, we can still target with cookies and device IDs. This is a question from Mark. Can you talk a little bit about, there's been quite a bit in the news. I feel like maybe it's been dampened some over the last couple of months, but what do you see as far as a cookieless future? We're not there yet, but what is that going to look like, and how would you recommend folks preparing, particularly within the pharmaceutical and healthcare space?
A great question, and yeah, you're right. It's definitely one that we're getting a lot. But I think really what it just means is it's going to be less about targeting an audience. We're not going to have these audiences made up of cookies any longer. It's really going to be that shift towards more of that contextual and publisher focus. So, it's looking at aligning your creative messaging or that content around the content that people are actually consuming in that moment versus, what that person looks like who is consuming that content. So just a shift there in the way that we target. And again, I mentioned with publishers too, a shift into maybe those custom site lists, private marketplace deals, focusing on the actual, content we want to reach users consuming versus the user themselves.
That's great. That's great. A few different questions about CTV. One, and I'll put these together. This one from Heather about, do you think the increase in shift to CTV advertising will be just temporary, or will this have a more long-term effect on planning strategies? And then a kind of second one, I think both these for you, April. How is CTV going to play a role in brand exposure amongst the 65 plus age group in coming times? So two different questions there, but both about CTV and I think maybe the growing audience, particularly within that older demographic.
Sure. Okay. No, good questions. My personal belief is that the increase and continued kind of adoption in lean in amongst consumers for CTV will remain permanent. I don't believe it's temporary. I think we might be seeing an initial temporary spike because people are spending more time at home. But I think, as I talked about last week, I think the longer people kind of shelter in place, we have these restrictions, new habits and new consumer behaviors and attitudes start to form and take shape. And I think individuals are starting to see that there's a lot of benefits. There's a lot of good programming. There's good advertising opportunities. And so I personally think we will start to see that become a bigger part of media mixes. I certainly think strategically it needs to be a strong consideration in media strategies in the overall mix. And then specifically for, maybe more mature audiences where that's not historically the first place they go to consume their TV content, I think that's a balance, quite honestly. I certainly think that it can be a additive component to a media strategy, and I think it certainly should. And I think a lot of that comes down to the specific message, the specific type of programming, and really balancing how you would use maybe more traditional or linear TV with connected TV. But I certainly think there is an opportunity to engage that audience. I would not completely remove that out of the consideration set, but I also don't know that the viewership is there to say that should 100% replace maybe what have been historical channels within the overall media strategy. But I think we're all learning new behaviors, and I think that extends to people that, like I said, are maybe a little bit more mature from an age standpoint.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I feel like it's fascinating to see just some of those subscription numbers, everything from the paid programming like a Netflix, and then even some of the free ones that are out there, that as people are maybe at home more, they've got these devices. They've got maybe a little bit more time on their hands to be able to enable those, or maybe tap into some family to troubleshoot some of that and kind of get them set up for more of the consumption with the connected TV. Lindsay, a question for you about kind of somewhat of a targeting side. This one, while it's a little bit specific, I thought it could be interesting just in some of the areas you spoke to. You speak a little bit more about maybe like medical journal specific targeting. This from Chris. He was saying that the last time that they looked, some of the journals that actually took some of those ads were pretty small. Thoughts on that, of like how that's changed, or maybe even some alternatives to be able to target that specific audience of medical practitioners and professionals?
Absolutely. Yes, I think first of all, it's finding the journals that actually do have ad placements, and then those that do, some of that traffic could be on the lower side. I wouldn't be surprised if we looked into a couple of them now to see how that has increased during this time. So I always recommend, when it comes to custom site lists, to create, one with at least 50 to 100 different sites, knowing that this is just one targeting tactic of many different tactics to try to drive traffic to publishers where you would want your ad to be seen, knowing that those other tactics, maybe with audience targeting or contextual targeting, can pick up some of that leftover spend. And then again, if any of these journals have, PMP opportunities through a deal ID where you have, a set amount of inventory available for you to bid on, those are also great ways to try to push more spend onto those specific sites. But yes, it is really up to the amount of inventory that we see come through in the open market. And then there's always opportunities too that if the DSP can't target those journals, utilizing Basis, we can contract with them directly to try to get some direct dollars there too.
Great. Well, we are at time, and I think not a big surprise. We've got several questions that we were not able to get to. I appreciate you submitting those. We'll follow up with those folks individually. And if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to us and reach out to your Centro main point of contact if you've got that. So I just want to say thank you everyone for joining us for the great questions. Thank you, Lindsay, April, for sharing your wonderful insight. Folks, as you're logging out, you will receive a survey, and I appreciate you giving us feedback on your experience. And as I mentioned earlier, the slides as well as the recording of this webinar will be sent to you via email within the next 24 hours or so, probably later today, in fact. I hope that you got a healthy dose of insights for pharma and healthcare. And next week, if you're not already registered and you want to join us again as we explore consumer packaged goods. So I encourage you all, stay healthy, stay positive, be well, and take care of yourself. This concludes our presentation for today. I'm Ryan Manchi. This has been a special webinar mini-series brought to you by the Centro Institute, and I'm so glad that you joined us. Have a great day.